You sacrifice your entire mortal life to keep the most powerful man in the city alive, only to hear him call your devotion a cage. When Vivian overheard the Vampire King say she was suffocating him, she didn't cry. She simply erased her existence and gave him the eternity of space he begged for. The air inside the Newport Manor was thick with the scent of sea salt, expensive Tom Ford cologne, and the faint, metallic underlying tang of warmed blood. It was the night of the winter solstice, the most important gathering for the Northeastern Vampiric Syndicates, and Vivian Montgomery was running on 3 hours of sleep and an unhealthy amount of espresso. Vivian wasn't one of them. She was entirely vulnerably human. Yet for the past 4 years, she had been the undisputed queen of this dark, glittering underworld. Not by bite, but by sheer unyielding competence, she had fallen in love with Dominic Cross, the enigmatic and ruthless patriarch of the New York factions. Loving Dominic wasn't like loving a normal man. It was like falling in love with a hurricane and trying to build a white picket fence inside the eye of the storm. Dominic had enemies. Ancient, wealthy, and violent enemies. When they first met, Dominic's empire was bleeding from the inside out due to daylight raids and corporate espionage. Vivian, a brilliant corporate strategist with a mind for logistics, had stepped in. She restructured his shell companies in Delaware, secured his daylight vulnerabilities in Manhattan, and personally oversaw his security detail. She learned to sleep with a silver-plated Glock under her pillow, and spent her days vetting the blood supply for any trace of liquid vervain or dead man's blood. She checked the UV-blocking tints on his fleet of matte black Audi RS7s weekly. She managed his alliances, his diet, his schedule, and his life. She did it because she loved him. She did it so he could sleep soundly while the sun was in the sky. But lately the tension between them had been a living, breathing thing in their Tribeca penthouse. Dominic had grown distant, his crimson eyes flashing with an irritated glint whenever she reminded him of safety protocols or asked him to delay a hunt until her security team cleared the perimeter. At the gala, Vivian stood near the grand sweeping staircase, her dark emerald gown brushing the marble floor. Her eyes scanned the room, noting the subtle power plays among the immortal elite. She noticed Dominic across the ballroom. He looked devastatingly handsome in his tailored velvet tuxedo, holding court with a casual, predatory grace. Noticing his glass was empty, Vivian quietly slipped away from the crowded floor to the private cellar upstairs to retrieve a very specific, highly coveted vintage of O-negative they had acquired from a private donor in Geneva. It was his favorite. As she approached Dominic's private mahogany-paneled study on the second floor, she heard voices bleeding through the heavy door, which had been left open just a crack. It was Dominic. Beside him, she recognized the smooth, aristocratic drawl of Declan Hughes, his second-in-command, and the bell-like, mocking laughter of Camilla Rossi. Camilla was a stunning 300-year-old socialite from the Venetian faction, who had always viewed Vivian as a temporary, fragile pet. "You look tense, Dom," Camilla purred, the sound of liquid splashing into a crystal glass, echoing in the quiet room. "The crown resting too heavy, or is your little mortal handler keeping the leash too tight?" Vivian froze her hand, hovering inches from the brass doorknob. She waited for Dominic to shut Camilla down. He always did. He always defended her. Instead, a heavy, exhausted sigh drifted through the crack in the door. "It's unbearable lately, to be honest." Dominic's deep baritone vibrated with genuine frustration. "She's suffocating me, Camilla. I can't step into a shadow without her throwing a contingency plan at my feet." "She's just trying to protect the Empire, Dominic," Declan interjected gently, though there was a note of sympathy in his voice. "The Boston syndicates are still active. I am the apex predator of the Eastern Seaboard, Declan." Dominic snapped his voice, echoing with sudden dark authority. "I survived 4 centuries before Vivian Montgomery was even a thought in the universe. Now I feel like a fragile glass doll living in a padded cell. She monitors my feeding, she tracks my cars, she interrogates my guests. It's like living with a mortal warden. I miss the air of the hunt. I miss the unpredictability of the night. Her constant hovering anxiety. It's draining. If she doesn't back off and give me some room to breathe, I don't know how much longer I can pretend this is working." Camilla laughed softly. "Then cut her loose, darling. You're a king. You don't need a babysitter." Outside the door, Vivian felt the warmth completely drain from her body. The heavy crystal bottle of Geneva vintage in her hands suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, suffocating him. A mortal warden. Draining. There were no tears. Vivian had spent 4 years navigating the most dangerous predators on Earth. She had long ago learned how to lock her emotions behind a steel vault. But inside the foundation of her entire world, violently cracked and crumbled into dust, she had given up her career, her friends, and the sunlight for him. She had aged while he remained frozen in time, pouring her youth into the machinery of his survival. And to him it wasn't an act of profound love. It was a cage. He was just pretending it was working. Vivian didn't push the door open. She didn't scream, and she didn't throw the bottle. She quietly set the rare vintage on a side table in the hallway, turned around, and walked silently away. If the Vampire King wanted space to breathe, she was going to give him the entire atmosphere. Vivian did not return to the ballroom. She slipped out the back service entrance of the Newport Manor, the cold December wind biting at her bare shoulders. She instructed a driver to take her directly to their primary residence, the secure penthouse in Manhattan. She had roughly 6 hours before the gala ended, and the sun rose, forcing Dominic into his daily slumber. 6 hours to systematically dismantle her existence in his world. The moment she stepped out of the private elevator and into the sprawling, silent penthouse, Vivian went to work with the cold, mechanical precision of a surgeon. First came the Empire. She booted up the encrypted mainframe in her home office. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she initiated a massive transfer of authority. The daylight banking codes, the security clearances for the offshore accounts, the legal proxy rights for cross-holdings, everything she had built and managed was formally, legally, and permanently reassigned to Declan Hughes. She left meticulous organized files detailing the upcoming contract renewals and the Boston Syndicate's suspected movements. She wasn't leaving out of spite to watch his empire burn. She was leaving to prove she was no longer his warden. Next, she went to their master bedroom. The closet was filled with designer gowns, imported silks, and jewels Dominic had showered her with over the years. She took none of it. She pulled a simple canvas duffel bag from the top shelf and packed only what she had brought into the relationship 4 years ago: 3 pairs of jeans, a few sweaters, her favorite combat boots, and her battered copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. She stood before the vanity mirror and unclasped the breathtaking 3-carat diamond pendant from her neck, a gift from Dominic for their 3rd anniversary. She laid it gently on the glass surface, placing her security keycard and the heavy tungsten ring he had given her right beside it. Underneath the jewelry, she left a piece of heavy cardstock stationery. She didn't write a manifesto. She didn't write a plea. She wrote 2 sentences. "Dominic, you mentioned feeling suffocated. I never wanted my love to be your cage. The empire is secured with Declan. Enjoy the air." Vivian. Now came the hardest part. How does a human hide from a vampire whose senses can track a drop of blood from a mile away? Vivian wasn't just a corporate strategist. She had been the archivist of his world. She knew their secrets better than they did. From the penthouse's secure vault, she retrieved a small sealed vial she had confiscated from a rogue witch a year prior. It was a potent, foul-smelling alchemical wash made of crushed copper, distilled wolfsbane, and eucalyptus absolute. It was designed to completely neutralize a human's biological scent signature. She stripped down, scrubbed her skin raw in the shower with the mixture, and washed her hair with it until she smelled of nothing but bitter earth and sterile metal. She dressed in her simple clothes, bypassed the building's main cameras by hacking her own security loop, and walked out into the freezing New York night. She didn't take a flight. She didn't use her credit cards. She bought a used, unremarkable Honda Civic from a cash-only lot in Queens, tossed her phone into the East River, and drove north into the dark. The sun had set, painting the Manhattan skyline in shades of bruised purple and black when Dominic Cross finally woke up. He stretched in the massive silk-sheeted bed, expecting the familiar warmth of Vivian beside him. He reached out his hand, grasping empty air. He frowned. Usually she was already up sitting at the edge of the bed with a mug of black coffee, giving him a rundown of the night's agenda. "Vivian!" His deep voice echoed in the cavernous room. Silence answered him. He swung his legs out of bed, feeling a strange, hollow quiet in the penthouse. It wasn't just quiet. It was dead. The subtle, comforting hum of her heartbeat, a sound he had unconsciously synchronized his own immortal life to, was missing. He walked out to the vanity and stopped dead. The diamond pendant, the keys, the ring, the note. Dominic picked up the heavy cardstock, his crimson eyes scanning her elegant handwriting. The words hit him like a physical blow to the chest. Enjoy the air. A cold spike of adrenaline shot through his veins. She had heard him. She had heard what he said to Camilla and Declan. His first instinct was panic, but he quickly forced it down, masking it with a surge of arrogant pride. Fine, he thought, his jaw clenching. She wants to throw a tantrum and prove a point. Let her. He crumpled the note in his fist. He had asked for space, hadn't he? This was just an overreaction. She would be back in a few days when she realized she missed the luxury, the power, and him. For the first week, Dominic actively leaned into his newfound freedom. He didn't have to check in. He didn't have to listen to lectures about security protocols. He threw lavish, wild parties at the penthouse that lasted until the very brink of dawn. Camilla practically moved in, filling the space with her intoxicating laughter and chaotic energy. Dominic hunted in the city without a security detail, feeling the raw, unfiltered thrill of the night he thought he had been missing. But by day 8, the cracks in the facade began to show. It started with the logistics. Declan burst into Dominic's study, looking more frazzled than he had in 2 centuries. Dom, the daylight transfer went through, but I don't know how the hell she managed this. Declan slammed a stack of legal documents on the desk. The offshore accounts are locked behind a biometric proxy I don't have access to, and the blood suppliers in Geneva are threatening to cut us off because Vivian isn't answering their calls. They don't trust us. They only trusted her. Dominic rubbed his temples, a dull ache forming behind his eyes. Just fix it, Declan. Bribe them? I can't bribe them if I can't move the daylight funds, Declan shot back. Then it was the blood. The private reserves tasted stale, lacking the precise temperature and chemical balance Vivian rigorously maintained. The penthouse, once a sanctuary of warmth and order, felt like a cold, empty museum. Camilla's constant chaotic presence, which had felt liberating on day 1, was now grating on his nerves like sandpaper. On day 14, Dominic stood on the balcony overlooking the city, the winter wind howling around him. He realized with a sickening twist in his gut that he hadn't felt a moment of true peace since she left. The suffocation he had complained about wasn't a cage. It was a shield. She had been taking the brunt of his empire's immense stress, filtering the chaos so he could reign comfortably. He didn't want to breathe the air of the hunt anymore. The air felt thin, freezing, and empty without her. Find her. Dominic ordered his elite tracking guard later that night, his voice devoid of its usual arrogant confidence. Tear the eastern seaboard apart. Bring her home. 3 days later, the head tracker, a lichen, with a sense of smell that could track a ghost across an ocean, stood in Dominic's study, looking at the floor. Well, Dominic growled, his eyes flashing a dangerous, unstable crimson. My king! The tracker swallowed hard. We swept the penthouse, her favorite spots, the transit hubs. Nothing. What do you mean, nothing? She's human. She leaves a trail, Dominic roared, shattering the crystal glass in his hand. "She doesn't," the tracker whispered in fear. She used a neutralizing wash. Heavy copper wolfsbane. Her scent signature is completely eradicated from the grid. She didn't use a credit card. She didn't take a flight. She's vanished, my king. It's as if Vivian Montgomery no longer exists. Dominic sank slowly into his leather chair, the shards of crystal biting into his palm, though he felt no pain. He stared at the empty vanity across the hall. He had demanded space from the only woman who ever truly cared for him. And now, in the deafening, terrifying silence of his crumbling empire, he realized he was going to drown in it. 6 months. It had been exactly 182 days since Vivian walked out of the Tribeca penthouse, leaving nothing but a tungsten ring and a hollow, suffocating silence in her wake. For an immortal who had lived through centuries of plagues, wars, and revolutions, 6 months should have felt like the blink of an eye. Instead, for Dominic Cross, it felt like a grueling, agonizing eternity of slow decay. The glittering facade of his empire was the first thing to shatter. Without Vivian's meticulous oversight, the Delaware shell companies began to bleed capital. Declan, for all his loyalty and battlefield prowess, was a soldier, not a savior of corporate logistics. He lacked Vivian's ruthless brilliance. Within the first 2 months, Cross Holdings caught the attention of human regulators. A minor oversight in a tax filing led to a quiet but aggressive inquiry from the SEC. To handle it, Dominic was forced to liquidate 3 of his most profitable commercial real estate assets in Lower Manhattan, taking a massive financial hit just to make the human auditors look the other way. Then came the predators. The Boston syndicates, sensing the sudden structural weakness in New York, began testing the borders. They didn't attack directly. They were too smart for that. Instead, they hit the supply lines. 2 blood transport trucks coming from their secure facilities in Geneva were hijacked on the interstate. Dominic's security teams, operating under outdated protocols that Vivian would have updated months ago, walked right into daylight ambushes. 6 of Dominic's best guards were turned to ash on a desolate stretch of highway in Connecticut. Dominic's inner circle was in absolute chaos. Camilla Rossi, whose chaotic energy Dominic had briefly mistaken for freedom, had become an intolerable nuisance. During a critical meeting with the terrified remaining blood suppliers, Camilla had laughed at a logistical concern, dismissing it as mortal trivia. Dominic had snapped. In a terrifying display of raw, unrestrained vampiric speed, he had pinned the 300-year-old socialite to the mahogany wall by her throat, his eyes blazing a feral, unstable crimson. He formally banished her from his territory that very night, threatening to permanently end her immortality if she ever crossed the George Washington Bridge again. But banishing Camilla didn't bring Vivian back. The Tribeca penthouse remained a tomb. Dominic stopped throwing parties. He stopped attending the high society galas. He spent his nights staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the glittering skyline, a glass of expensive, tasteless bourbon in his hand, drowning in the bitter realization of his own catastrophic arrogance. He had called her a cage. He had called her a warden. He hadn't realized that the walls of that cage were the only things holding the crushing weight of the world off his shoulders. He had mistaken her absolute, selfless devotion for a chain. His attempts to find her had become a terrifying, obsessive mania. When his supernatural trackers failed, stymied by the chemical wash Vivian had used to erase her scent, Dominic turned to the human world. He funneled millions of dollars into hiring elite private military contractors and ex-intelligence operatives. He bought backdoor access to Palantir's analytical software and ran the facial recognition databases of Clearview AI through every traffic camera, ATM lens and airport security feed on the eastern seaboard. Nothing. It was as if the earth had opened up and swallowed her whole. Vivian knew his methods because she had designed them. She knew exactly where the blind spots in the surveillance grid were. The breakthrough, when it finally came, wasn't a result of high-tech surveillance or supernatural tracking. It was a result of Vivian's one lingering vulnerability, her need to maintain the scent-masking wash. On a damp Tuesday night in late October, a human investigator named Caldwell, a former Pinkerton agent, Dominic, kept on a lucrative retainer, requested a secure audience at the penthouse. Caldwell laid a single grainy photograph on Dominic's massive oak desk. "She's brilliant, I'll give her that," Caldwell said, his voice completely devoid of the trembling fear that most mortals exhibited around the Vampire King. She didn't use a credit card, a phone, or a registered vehicle. She fell completely off the digital grid. But she needs raw wolfsbane and distilled copper to keep her scent masked from your kind. Those aren't exactly items you can pick up at a local pharmacy. She had to grow the wolfsbane herself. Dominic stared at the photograph. His undead heart, which rarely beat at all, gave a painful, violent lurch against his ribs. It was a still frame from a low-resolution security camera inside a commercial hardware store in Bangor, Maine. The woman in the photo was wearing a heavy wool peacoat, a beanie pulled low over her forehead, and a thick scarf. Her face was mostly obscured, but Dominic didn't need to see her face. He knew the precise, elegant slope of her shoulders. He knew the way she stood her weight perfectly balanced, constantly assessing her surroundings. She paid in cash for high-intensity UV grow lights and specialized hydroponic fertilizer. Caldwell continued, pointing to a printed receipt next to the photo. I traced the serial numbers of the UV lamps. The manufacturer includes a mail-in warranty card. Someone mailed it back from a post office box in a small coastal logging town about an hour south of Bangor, Camden, Maine. She's operating under the name Victoria Vance, though she hardly uses it. Dominic's fingers trembled slightly as he picked up the photograph. The overwhelming, crushing wave of relief that crashed over him was immediately followed by a sickening spike of dread. He had found her. But what the hell was he going to say? Call the pilot. Dominic whispered, his voice rough and fractured. He didn't look up from the grainy image. Prep the jet. I go alone. Sir, travelling into an unknown territory without your security detail. Declan started to protest from the corner of the room. I said I go alone. Declan? Dominic roared, the sheer concussive force of his voice rattling the bulletproof glass of the penthouse windows. He immediately reined himself in, smoothing his tailored suit jacket with shaking hands. I am not going there as a king. I am going there as a beggar. Prepare the jet. The coastal town of Camden, Maine, was a harsh, unforgiving place as the bitter winter approached. The biting wind whipped fiercely off the dark Atlantic Ocean, smelling strongly of freezing salt spray and dying pine needles. It was a desolate town populated by weathered fishermen, exhausted loggers, and people who desperately wanted to be left entirely alone. Dominic Cross arrived exactly 2 hours after the sun had finally dipped below the icy horizon. He parked his rented, heavily tinted, inconspicuous black vehicle a full mile outside of the town limits, and slowly walked the rest of the dark, freezing way. His supernatural senses flared brightly as he navigated the dimly lit cobblestone streets. He absolutely didn't need a specialized tracker anymore. Now that he was within a tight radius, even the potent chemical wash she utilized could not entirely mask the agonizing magnetic pull she effortlessly exerted on his deadened soul. He quickly found her at the desolate edge of the industrial harbor. She was working out of a small, fortified corrugated steel office attached to a massive commercial freight yard. Through the frosted, cracked glass window, Dominic silently and obsessively watched her every single move with total awe. She looked absolutely magnificent. The heavy stress that had constantly bracketed her mouth and tightened her dark eyes in New York was entirely gone. She wore thick denim jeans, a heavy cream sweater, and her dark hair was tied back in a messy knot. She leaned intently over a sprawling, detailed map of maritime shipping lanes, aggressively negotiating with a burly truck driver over a crackling radio transmitter. She expertly managed the complex logistics for a massive shipping corporation. Even deep in hiding, she naturally commanded the entire room. She was inherently born to rule an empire with absolute power. Dominic stood motionless in the freezing, relentless rain for a full, agonizing hour, just silently watching the steady rise and fall of her chest. He felt exactly like a starving, desperate man staring helplessly at a lavish feast behind a thick pane of unbreakable glass. Finally, the noisy freight yard completely shut down for the evening. The exhausted workers cleared out, the heavy iron gates were securely padlocked, and Vivian was left completely alone to close up the quiet office. Dominic finally stepped out of the freezing shadows and slowly approached the heavy steel door with absolute, pure dark terror. He did not bother to knock. He simply reached out and gently turned the brass handle, which instantly snapped under his immense, suppressed strength, allowing the heavy door to swing widely open. Vivian did not jump in surprise. She did not scream in terror. When the icy, violent wind blew fiercely into the heated, cramped office, she calmly finished logging a complex shipping manifest on her bright computer monitor, smoothly hit the save button, and then slowly, deliberately turned around in her squeaky swivel chair. Her intelligent amber eyes locked intensely onto his glowing, desperate, crimson gaze, without flinching once. There was no lingering fear in her beautiful expression. There was absolutely no joy. There was only a terrifying, Arctic, absolute indifference. "You broke the heavy lock," Vivian stated, her voice perfectly steady, entirely devoid of any emotional warmth. "I will absolutely have to dock that from your holding company corporate retainer if you plan on doing any actual business here, Mr. Cross." Dominic stepped fully inside, shutting the broken door tightly behind him to successfully block the howling wind. He stood completely vulnerably exposed. The powerful apex predator of the eastern seaboard was violently stripped of his formidable armor. He collapsed heavily to his knees on the dirty, scuffed linoleum floor. "I was a miserable fool," Dominic whispered, his deep voice trembling uncontrollably, staring desperately up at her. "I was an arrogant, blind, catastrophic fool. You were not a heavy cage, Vivian. You were the vital foundation, firmly keeping me securely tethered to my crumbling sanity. The entire empire is falling completely apart without you. I am absolutely suffocating without you here. Please come home." Vivian looked down. "You honestly think this is just about a simple apology? I do not want a price. I want a beautiful crown." She walked over to a securely locked steel filing cabinet, pulled a tiny brass key from her pocket, unlocked the drawer, and abruptly tossed a thick black dossier onto the floor, directly in front of his knees. "The Boston Syndicate is planning a highly coordinated massive strike on the summer solstice. They have successfully infiltrated the secure Geneva blood supply chain. They are heavily lacing the shipment with a highly lethal silver compound. I uncovered this. I currently hold the absolute, terrifying power to easily stop this deadly shipment, or I can simply let it sail directly into New York. I am never returning to that penthouse merely as your mortal handler," Vivian stated, stepping forward until her combat boots touched his kneeling legs. "I demand an unbreakable blood oath, legally declaring me the absolute equal ruler of the New York Syndicate. My word entirely overrides yours in all matters. I am fully ruling the empire now. You either stand up firmly, take my hand as a king, taking his true queen, or you prepare to burn." Without a single moment of hesitation, Dominic reached up, grasped her hand, and kissed her knuckles, in absolute, complete, and eternal romantic surrender. And that is how a mortal queen brought the arrogant vampire king to his knees, proving that the ultimate power isn't immortality, but knowing your exact worth. If you loved watching Vivian claim her absolute crown and make Dominic regret his mistakes, smash that like button. Share this video with a friend who loves a good revenge romance, and subscribe to the channel for more thrilling stories.